Hello again. Here is once more your friendly neighborhood Ugaritologist and biblical scholar, Ola Wikander, back with yet another video about some banal and some perhaps not so banal things you can learn from academic biblical studies and comparative linguistics. Today, we're going to talk about three different things. First, we're going to talk a little about what biblical Hebrew is and is not, and how texts written in that language sometimes need to be approached. And then we're going to do a little follow-up on the last video in which I talked about Tocharian first-person pronouns and the gender distinction therein. So, the first thing I want to say is that one thing you learn from doing academic biblical studies is the fact that the Hebrew language, the ancient Hebrew language, the biblical Hebrew language, is not a specifically theological language. To be sure, many people who study it today, be they Jewish or Christian or otherwise affiliated or unaffiliated, do study it for theological reasons. They're interested in the Old Testament slash Hebrew Bible, which is, after all, one of the most important collections of religious texts that humanity has ever produced, given its enormously wide reception history in several religions. So, in that sense, the literature studied is very often theological in nature, although it must be said that there are people who study biblical Hebrew who are not into it for the religion. That must always be borne in mind. My point is that the language itself, classical Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, was not any more of a theological language than any other. It's regarded as theologically coded because of the literature that is preserved in it. The Hebrew Bible, the Mishnah, which is in Mishnaic Hebrew, which isn't biblical Hebrew, but it's still ancient Hebrew. But when classical Hebrew, ancient Hebrew was a spoken language, it would have been a spoken language like any other. We know this from the fact that there are preserved inscriptions in ancient Hebrew that are very down to earth. They talk about people stealing each other's garments and the party victim to the theft complaining about it, or they talk about the completion of a tunnel being excavated. Things like that, very mundane things, not deep stuff. And this is important. And this is a rather banal thing, but there are people out there who don't quite get this and think that since such important religious literature was preserved in ancient Hebrew, that must mean that the language itself is somehow religious in essence. And the problem here is, of course, that languages don't have essences that way. To the extent that they do, that is due to their literary cultivation, not any inherent essence of the languages themselves. That would be a very sort of rank version of linguistic relativity, the idea that our thoughts are being, so to speak, controlled by the language we speak. And very few, if any, linguists would take that idea that far today. So biblical Hebrew is not any more theological than any other language. There are such wonderful examples of this, like one of my most cherished, because it's so funny, biblical Hebrew expressions, Mashdin Bakir, the one that urinates onto the wall. Well, it means man as opposed to woman. It's very in your face or on your wall, if you prefer that. It's not very deep. I mean, there are, of course, expressions in the Hebrew Bible that are very deep and in biblical Hebrew that do have innumerable layers of meaning to them that have been superimposed over the years and inherited etymologically and all that. But that goes for any language that has important, substantial literature that has grown through centuries. It's not due to any specific essence of the Hebrew language. Ancient Hebrew was a language like any other. It just happened to get a very specific type of literature attached to it. That's actually an odd piece of history, the way in which biblical Hebrew was preserved basically by means of one corpus of texts. One not very long corpus of text, by the way. The Hebrew Bible is about 1,500 pages of Hebrew, and it's not even all in Hebrew, a little bit is in Aramaic. But that's sort of codified this language. Similar things have happened in other cases. It's not the only one, but it's special. And that can give people the wrong idea of what the language is and was like. So Biblical Hebrew, when it was spoken, was a language like any other. It just happened to get a very, very specific type of literature and religious tradition attached to it. The second thing is about difficult texts. You hear this sometimes when people talk about biblical texts. They say, oh, this is a very difficult text. And I'm here to tell you that this expression is often used in a very weird way. When people say that, oh, this is such a difficult text, what they often mean is this is a text that seems, at least to many modern minds, morally repugnant. This is a text that advocates slavery or killing or whatever. And they say it's a difficult text. Well, that's kind of a misuse of the word. For a philologian, the only definition of a difficult text is a text that is hard to understand, a text that has philological cruxes in it. That is, the text is unclear or the meaning of a verb is not known with a high degree of certainty. If it's quite clear what the text means, it is by definition not difficult. It may be challenging if you have a personal relationship to the Hebrew Bible or any other text in which these passages occur, but it's not difficult in the sense that it's hard to understand. Of course, there are texts both difficult in the philological and the quote unquote moralistic sense, but that's as maybe, actually. People sometimes do a sort of weird cognitive jump that because a text is challenging from a moral perspective, that also means it's difficult to understand. Well, not very. There are lots of texts, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, but also in many other collections of ancient texts that are quite easy to understand, but seem to many people today to be morally repugnant. Psalm 137 is a very famous example, but there are so many others. It's not hard to understand what it means, but what it says can make you kind of whoop. So I would exhort you to use the term difficult in a more specific sense, not just to say that a text is difficult as a way of getting out of needing to face up to what it says. I mean, for some people, it's not difficult at all because those people maybe don't have a personal relationship to the Hebrew Bible or whatever textual collection we're talking about, but they can still make a judgment on what it means or would have meant to the early hearers. Okay, and the third thing was about Tocharian. In the video before, I talked a little bit about the fact that East Tocharian has two first-person singular pronouns, nish for masculine and yuk for feminine, which is quite rare, and especially within the Indo-European family to which Tocharian belongs, it's basically non-existent outside of East Tocharian. And I talked about an article, a very good article by J. Jasanoff, which provided, I think, still the best explanation for this phenomenon. His argument being that the masculine form nish is the old accusative me, and the feminine nyuk is the old nominative ego, that is I. His argument being that the women would have used the quote unquote conservative way of saying mutatis mutandis, saying it is I, whereas the men would have started saying it is me, a more innovative use of the case form, and that over time this discrepancy became coded as not as different case forms, but as masculine and feminine forms. I talked about this, by the way, in relation to certain social slash morphological developments of the Hebrew language, which I've written about. You can watch the last video to see what I'm on about. And I got a couple of comments saying that this explanation of Jasanoff's is a bit unexpected, since it's often argued that women tend to be leading in linguistic development, that is, in renewal of languages, that women tend to be the ones adopting new idioms faster than men on average. Well, the argument that Jasanoff gives, it is one of conservatism and innovation, but it's also one of what one could refer to when talking about, say, Japanese as rough style and polite style. In Japanese, there are, as many of you will know, a number of different levels of politeness versus roughness in speech, and both men and women can use both polite styles and rough styles, but it's much more common for men to use the quote unquote rough styles of speech than it is for women, for historical and sociological reasons, like using formal pronouns and so on, as opposed to informal ones, is more common in the speech of women, at least has been. And that's the sort of argument that Jasanoff uses for Tocharian. He explicitly invokes that example, by the way, this idea that it's not just a matter of innovation versus conservatism, though it is that to a degree, but it's also a matter of, he argues, the women having spoken in a more polite and quote unquote polished, yes, I do say quote unquote a lot, and I like it, quote unquote polished way than the men who would have no problem saying it's me rather than it's I, so to speak. So that's his argument, that it has to do with levels of social politeness, where the women would have spoken in a more polite way and the men in a more rough style like way, in a way analogous to what you find in Japanese. And by the way, he also argues that the reason we find this gender division in the first person pronoun in one of the Takarian languages is partly due to the fact that it was spoken in the extreme east of the area covered by Indo-European languages, spoken at the extreme east of that area in what is today Western China. And his argument is that many languages in East Asia have social and gender-based coding of pronouns and other parts of the morphological system in a way that is not quite as common in, say, Europe. And he argues that this was an adstrate influence from the area in which East Takarian was spoken. And this is, of course, possible. So his argument is not necessarily that women are more conservative, but that women in this context would have used more polite and quote unquote polished language. Also, I would like to make a correction. I say in that last video, I say correctly that East Tocharian is the only one of the two Tocharian languages that has this gender distinction in the first person singular pronoun. I also say that Proto-Tocharian, that is the language from which both East and West Tocharian proceeded, that Proto-Takarian did not have such a distinction, and I personally find it quite reasonable that it didn't. But Jasanoff actually argues that the beginning of the distinction was there already in Proto-Takarian, so that's his view, or at least that the blurring of the case forms that led to one of the case forms, the nominative being coded as feminine and the accusative being coded as masculine, that goes back to Proto-Takarian. So 3 things for today. 1, Ancient Hebrew is not a theological language. It's just a language that happens to have a lot of theologically important literature written in it. 2, a text being difficult to a philologian only means that it's hard to understand for philological reasons. Don't confuse that with a text being morally challenging in one way or another. And 3, Takarian pronouns, East Takarian pronouns in the first person may have, at least according to Jasanoff, appeared through a distinction not only between conservative and innovative, but between polite and rough. And remember that the texts we know today as the Bible, or for that matter, Tocharian texts or Sanskrit texts or whatever ancient text you're reading, they do tend to read better in their original languages. Bye-bye.